Hello, music lovers. Welcome back. Now, I know last week I said try not to get lost in the numbers, but many of you have been asking things like, should I have my levels at -6 this or -12 that? And why is your master always in the red? In order to explain that properly, we're going to have to ignore last week's advice and get quite technical. We're going to dive under the hood of your DAW and digital music behavior in general. And hopefully by the end, even if you don't fully understand everything, you should have an idea what this technology can and cannot do for your music. Let's go. Okay then, so for all of you that have ever asked me a question like, should my tracks be at -6 or -12 or -10 even, pick any arbitrary number. This little experiment is just for you. We're going to play a game. Here's a top loop. I'm going to add a kick drum to it, and I want you to tell me which kick is louder. Here is kick number 1. Here's kick 2. Back to the first kick. Kick 2. Okay, let's look at the meters, shall we? Here's kick 1. So that measures at basically 0, full peak. Kick 2 is measuring at -0.76. Roughly the same, but slightly lower. So according to the meters, kick 1 is louder. Let me know down below. Is that what you heard? Okay, so I hear you. I know what you're saying. Those are peak meters. We all know digital peak meters can't be trusted, right? Don't we? Let's look at some average metering instead. I'm going to leave kick 2 in. And here we have some bassline. So here is bassline number 1. Bass number 2. Back to bass 1. Bass 2. Okay, let's check the average levels. Here is Span, one of the more reliable metering softwares. And what we're looking for is this RMS, root mean squared figure here. Bass 1 reads as... I'm going to let it settle. Okay, so that's settled on an average of 1.5. Bass 2. Let it settle. Okay, 1.1, 1.2. Okay, so about the same, but technically the second bass is quieter. Is that what you heard? Okay, I've lined up another experiment for you. Here is a full track. This is a mastered track. It's one of mine. It's the first drop from the Tech House track on the Frisian tutorial. Sounds like that. What we're going to do now is take away some of the low and high frequencies. just using a low pass and a high pass filter to take away some of the lows and highs. Here's with it off and on. So out of those, which do you hear as the quieter signal? Let's look at the meters. Here is the original master. As you might expect, it's at full scale 0. Now with the lows and highs taken away. Suddenly it's over 3 dB louder now. How did that happen? What's going on? Let's test again. 0. Keep your eye on the master here. It's at 0. And when we take away some sound, now all of a sudden we are clipping, even though we took away signal. What is going on? Now here is the really tragic part. Let's get a limiter involved. If I play the original, it's doing nothing. You can see there's no activity here. The track isn't going over 0, so the limiter doesn't react. Now if we take away the lows and highs, now our limiter has to act. So even though it sounds like there's less signal, the limiter now has to act. Even worse, pay attention to what it does to the punch of the drums. Did you catch that? We lost a little bit of the punch of the drums. So not only is it reacting to what we can't hear, it's reacting to the opposite of what we think we're hearing. Now, pay attention to the master. Despite taking away low and high frequencies, oh no, the big scary red light has appeared. No one wants to see that. Fear not though, I have a magic trick. Here's a clipping plugin. It's Free Clip by Ven Audio. Hooray! The scary red light has gone away. That means we're not clipping anymore. Right, we're still not done with the audio illusions and confusions. Here's another test. Which is louder? My fully mastered track, or this single square wave? That? Or this? The answer is, they're both exactly the same volume. Okay, last test. The ultimate test of our wonderful technology. I have a commercial track here, released recently. Quite famous. Many of you should know what this is. And the game is, I want you to guess the track. Here is your first clue. Okay, that's not very fair, is it? Let me help you some more. How about this? Does this help? No? Not got it yet? Don't worry if you haven't got it yet. We have so many more clues to show you. LUFS measurement, -6, very loud. I already told you it was a modern track. No? Still no idea? Let me give you another clue. That one's showing width versus frequency. So we can see it's quite mono. Still no idea, huh? Okay. What about this one? No? Still nothing? Okay. Let's keep going. What about some VU meters? Still haven't got it. Okay, right. The ultimate clue is this. So the track is... What do you mean you don't know? That was all the clues in the world, ever. I think you get my point, right? Now, if it's any consolation to you, I wouldn't have passed any of those tests either. I understand how convenient it would be to have a simple rule of thumb like kick at 0 and bass at -12, something like that, but life just isn't that simple, I'm afraid. What's happening with meters like this is you are trying to apply a one-dimensional tool to a four-dimensional medium. Those channel meters, for example, are only giving you the very peak of the signal, which is not related to how we hear, and you could argue they have a time element, but that release time on your peak meters is fixed. It doesn't react like our ears do, depending on frequency and what came before. There's also a biological deficiency at play here, in that our eyes are far less sensitive than our ears. Even if the visual technology of these meters could react as fast as our ears require, our eyes would still not be able to keep up. Any gamers out there will know a good frame rate required for fluent motion on a screen is up in the 250 frames per second kind of area, whereas our ears require 44,000 frames a second in order to hear fluent audio. Despite this, unfortunately, biologically, our eyes rule our ears. In other words, what you see in front of you can actually change the way you perceive sound. It's known as the McGurk Effect. I'll link to a great video in the description. So, you are not alone if you are seeking visual help to supplement your ear training. We all do that. But just know, the reality is, the only true way to judge sound is with our ears. Right, moving on to the really controversial subject. This big red light over here. Red means bad, right? We've all been trained to know that. But the truth isn't so black and white. Before I explain how that red light is calculated, I need to first explain why I work like I do. It all stems from a session many years ago when I was tasked with mastering a hip-hop album. Now, I wasn't a hip-hop guy, but the client trusted my general engineering skills. However, despite my supposed talents, I was struggling to get good results. So I went away and did some research. That led me to some Dr. Dre interviews, and the subject of clipping came up. Now, it wasn't as simple as just clipping or not clipping. The mix had to be changed, and even some of the sounds. But in the end, we ended up with a great master. One which defied all my engineering training. This master had no limiter on it, and was hitting the red. But the strange thing was, none of us could hear any clipping in a fully treated room on high-end gear. And despite having access to some of the best limiters at the time, Ozone, UAD, Waves, it was a marked improvement over using any of those. So what was going on? Now, also at this time, I was reading Bob Katz's book, Mastering Audio, The Art and the Science. And one quote which blew my mind was, "The best mixes don't need mastering." Between that and the Dr. Dre interviews, a seed was planted. If the mastering process is not actually necessary, what if I could just mix at 0 and adjust the mix so that the clipping was transparent? Being the nerd I am, I dived a bit deeper. Let me show you what's going on the technical side of all of this. Right, so this applies regardless of what DAW you are in, but you may not know that this fader over here, your master fader, is not the same as all the other faders in your software. Ableton kind of hints at this because when we go above 0 on the track fader, our signal is still shown in a green, whereas on the master fader, If we go above 0, our signal changes to red. And that's because the signals are actually calculated differently. Get ready for the geeky bit. The track faders in our DAW operate at a higher resolution. They have more bits to use, and that results in more usable headroom, or amount of total level, if you will. It also helps with sonic accuracy. In practical terms, it means you can't clip these tracks. They have over 700 decibels available in each direction, above 0 and below 0. To put that in perspective, the louder gigs you've probably ever been to have been around the 120 decibel mark. What we call the threshold of pain is around the 140 decibel mark. And sounds over the 200 decibel mark would kill you. In other words, plenty of headroom. This is achieved with some clever mathematics called floating point mathematics. Without getting too technical on you, imagine a calculator with a fixed amount of displayable digits. In digital audio terms, that total number is known as our bit depth. More available numbers equals more levels or more headroom. And a calculator that can display more digits can not only represent more numbers in total, its calculations will be more accurate without having to round up or round down. Now imagine there are two types of calculator. One of them cannot move the decimal point. So the maximum available numbers to the left of the decimal point are fixed, and the maximum available numbers to the right of the decimal point are fixed. This is called fixed point. The second type of calculator can move the decimal point, what we call a floating point. This gives it exponentially more available numbers to represent. So what does all this mean in terms of sound? Well, 24-bit fixed point audio can represent just above 144 decibels, which is about the amount humans can hear. 32-bit floating point, which is what our DAWs operate in, actually has the same total amount of digits as 24-bit, but it can move the decimal point, giving it a range of 1,526 decibels. Impressive, but completely unnecessary, right? Well, no, it's not just about total level, it's about accuracy. If you add 6 dB to a fader, the internal calculation on that is rather simple, it's just times 2. But if you add 4.56 decibels to a fader, send that into a compressor, EQ, etc., all those calculations are going to result in a lot of extra numbers, and without high resolution, there will be a lot of rounding errors, which in audio becomes noise and distortion. That's why most audio engines are 32-bit floating point engines. Now, I had to explain that, so we can now discuss what goes on with the master fader. So, the master fader, or master track, should I say, does not use this clever floating point thing. What you are seeing and indeed hearing on your master track is your sound device's driver. In order to get sound from the virtual world into the real world, it has to be converted into analog voltage. And to do that, it has to be moved into the fixed point domain. And so far, there are no converters which can achieve the same dynamic range as human hearing, that 140 decibels-ish. So it makes sense that most audio drivers today operate at 24-bit fixed resolution. Okay, I've got a quick example lined up here just to show you this in practice. Here's a drum beat. What I've done is cranked this by 140 decibels and then turned it back down by 140 decibels. Now, if we are truly in a 32-bit float audio engine, everything should sound the same. It does. If this was a fixed point audio engine, that would have sounded like digital death, because we would have exceeded the ceiling and we would not be able to recover back down from it. We don't have to presume, however, we can prove this by exporting the file at those bit depths. So I have exported that drum loop plus 140 decibels out as a 24-bit audio file. Here it is, re-imported. It's turned down for your safety, but this is what it sounds like. So that's what happens at 24-bit fixed point. That's turned down by 26 decibels, by the way. Bear in mind, 6 decibels is twice the volume. However, if I export this as a 32-bit floating point file and bring it back in, you can see it still struggled to draw the waveform. It's so loud, in fact, I can't even reduce the gain on this waveform enough to affect the visual. Now, this is turned back down by 140 decibels, but if we play this back, here's the original. As you can hear, perfectly intact. So that's the difference between 32-bit float and 24-bit fixed. In practical terms, what this means for your master track is it can clip. And all clipping is when the signal exceeds 0. But in a fixed point audio domain, above 0 does not exist. That's why clipping looks like a straight line, because it's literally a row of zeros. Now, the reason this is deemed bad is a row of zeros is most likely not what the original signal was intended to be. Unless your original signal was a digital square wave, then anything resulting in a row of zeros means something must have gone wrong somewhere. Therefore, we get an error or a red light. However, if the computer cannot understand values above 0, how does it know that the signal truly went above? And the answer is, it actually doesn't. The trigger conditions for that red light are hilariously simple. The red light comes on when the signal spends 3 or more consecutive samples at 0. That's it. Now, I'm not talking samples like the samples you or I would use. I'm talking about digital signal samples, as in 3 samples out of the 44,000 a second that your audio sample rate is running at. So that's all it takes. If 3 samples in a row occur at 0, it assumes somewhere in between the first and the third, a clip must have happened. That's all it knows. Now think about that. Just 3 samples out of 44,000 in a second. That's typically too fast for most ears to pick up on. Certainly in the context of a more complex signal. Or should I say, music. So it comes back to what we were discussing earlier. What we see from these meters does not necessarily correlate to how we perceive sound, especially musical sound. So to sum all that up, my way of working just comes down to listening as opposed to looking. I'm not saying it's the best way, and I'm not saying I would recommend it to those without good ear training. But now you know. My red light is on all the time because that is digital doing digital things. I do not mean to encourage egregious distortion of your music if that is not what is appropriate to your sound. In my case, it's because of the opposite. Letting the red light come on results in less distortion than from a limiter trying to deal with digital signals which don't correlate to how I perceive the music anyway. Okay, rant over. As always, I hope you learned something. If you did, you know what to do. If you didn't know about the link in the description to buy me a coffee, now you do. And until next week, I'll see you in the comments. Bye-bye.